And so what's your Twitter handle?
It'll be coming up. It's at Pat Britton at Twitter as we go live with a comedian out of Christchurch, Joe Ghastly. Joe, good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon to you, Pat.
Hey, very good to be with you. Thank you so much for coming and joining us. It's lovely to see you there in Christchurch, which is where you're based at the moment. How is lovely Christchurch today?
Yes, Christchurch is somewhat overcast, but otherwise good. So a nice cool day for doing things.
Being here in Dunedin,
yes.
we often, when I say often, probably more than many get to Christchurch. It's the last time I was there, I probably haven't been there for a few months, but the last time I was there, it still sort of had the vibe or the feel of being a bit broken. You know, because the quakes were a decade ago, but there's still a lot of work to do. Is it still the case today? My enduring memories of Christchurch.
It's a strange sort of juxtaposition that you've got glossy new bars and restaurants and new buildings next to things that are still the same as they were in 2011, barricaded with falling down bits of buildings. So it feels like there's a derelict collapse in Christchurch with new growth kind of springing up around it. So an interesting mix.
It's an interesting kind of visual imagery there. I'm just thinking about an overgrown garden. You know, you've got the new raised garden bed, but in the background all the weeds and stuff still growing there in the background. My sort of enduring memory of Christchurch the last few times I was there was people come back and say, oh, how was your weekend in Christchurch? And I'm like, all I can remember is yellow visibility vests, high visibility vests, and orange cones on the road. They still seem to be everywhere.
Yeah, I guess it's a never-ending. It seems like they repair a road and then they dig it up to put down, fibre internet, and then they dig it up to, probably the same as many cities, but seems to be happening a lot in Christchurch.
Now you're a fascinating cat because you're a comedian based in Christchurch who appears to have gotten to the kind of comedy space kind of later than many, but you're also a psychiatrist. And so I think what a fascinating mix of a person to then perform their truth, perform their life. All the best comedy seems to come from somewhere in someone's life. So give us your synopsized story. I mean, how did you get to be, I don't know if the first time you got on stage was first performed comedy in 2017 when you were 48. That's what your write-up says. So tell us what led to, I mean, we're basically the same age, but that what led to getting on stage to do stand-up at what most people would consider a very late stage in life compared to many who start.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So in terms of actually starting stand-up, I was doing a TV pilot for a show that was called Dead Famous that never got funded, but was a lot of fun. And there were several stand-up comedians who were in the cast because it was a comedy TV pilot. And one of the comedians is also a comedy producer, and he suggested to me that I try stand-up. And there was a fresh competition coming up for first-timers a few weeks after that, so I decided to take the plunge and had a lot of fun doing it and kept doing it, basically. So it was a little bit opportunistic. To me, doing stand-up comedy was probably a bit like doing something like a bungee jump that you think you'll never do it, but you might do it on the spur of the moment, and it's a lot more fun than you think it is. So.
And I'm not sure if all your comedy comes around this character piece, but I'd like to know about this piece you have, and it seems to be the cool mum. The cool mum, when I've looked around you on the internet and looked and found what you're all about and what you do, the cool mum seems to be a character-driven piece. I'm assuming it's the kind of female version of the cool dad, which a lot of people would more recognise.
Yeah, it's interesting because it very much evolved. I think when I first did stand up, it was basically just me telling my truth about my parenting inadequacies and trying to be a cool parent to get on with your teenagers and know their lingo and things. And I was quite interested. Brendan Lovegrove, when he first saw me perform in about 2019, said, not really into character comedy, but that was really great. And that was the first time I actually thought of myself as a character comedian as opposed to me just doing my truth in a slightly heightened version of myself. So I think it's very much evolved from me to an extreme version of me that's now taken on some characteristics in my solo show. Because the premise of the solo show is that I'm a self-proclaimed cool mum who's gone on to be an international personal development guru, sharing my coolness with the world. So it's gone from basically me to where I could go if I had no insight whatsoever in terms of ridiculousness. So it is a character, and right from the beginning I decided to perform as Joe Ghastly, to differentiate it from me as Dr. Joanna Prendergast, psychiatrist, that not everything said on stage was necessarily directly me. It was through a lens of a character.
I was going to ask about that because there is that professional element, and I hadn't even asked you yet, but whether you use your real name at all in any of your performances, because we think about Radar as to Radar. Probably 99% of the people out there don't know his name is Andrew Lumsden, although he has mentioned it on stage a couple of times, and he's not that he hides away from it. So it's an active way to keep your, I was going to say professional and personal life, but it's not, isn't it? It's almost your professional and your other professional life separate.
Yeah, and I think certainly all the comedy I do is Joe Ghastly. I've done a few sort of TV roles and some small feature film roles where I've been credited as Joanna Prendergast. So with my acting agent, I'm Joanna Prendergast. So Joe Ghastly is specifically the comedy part of my performance role.
And where did where did the name Ghastly come from? Is it just that it's the second part of your surname, or is it more to do with the character?
It's basically a play on my real name. It was actually the creative director of the improv troupe that I'm part of who suggested Joe Ghastly to me, sort of right back at the beginning. So I had to credit him to the evolution of the name. Also because there's a ghastly element to my character as well, in terms of the complete lack of self-awareness creates some kind of fairly ghastly behaviour. So ghastly is quite appropriate for the character as well.
Your life as a parent, and then your life as a professional psychiatrist. I mean, having never been to a psychiatrist, I'm some of these are assumptions. You can tell me how it all works, but I'm assuming that therefore gives you insight into how people operate, what they do, how they work, how their minds work. I'm thinking that must make a really interesting dynamic when you're going through and thinking, how do I sell this to an audience? Because you might find something funny in a story, but as a psychiatrist, you might have to step back and kind of go, but there are flow-ons for this, for that person or that experience, which may not be all that healthy. How do you separate those things?
Yeah, I think it is all very complex. I mean, I think in terms of what I find funny, and will it be funny, one of the real benefits of stand-up comedy is that it's an art form where you get immediate feedback. So the first time you get a joke, do it to an audience, you get immediate feedback of whether you've hit the mark or not, or whether you need to tune it up or drop it completely. So I think from that point of view, the audience basically tells you if you're doing your job right. I think, I mean, hopefully as a psychiatrist, as well as developing insight into how other people work, it also helps you to develop insight into yourself as well. And I guess part of comedy is being aware of your weaknesses and vulnerabilities and probably amplifying them. So if you're someone who tends to try and kind of modify yourself to please other people, you do that even more. Or if you're very socially awkward, you do that even more. Or if you keep doing ridiculous, embarrassing things, you amplify that further. So I think that insight into your own vulnerabilities is part of comedy, and hopefully being a psychiatrist gives more awareness of that. I think there's a lot of psychology to what makes people laugh, but that's built into joke writing techniques, like the element of surprise and things like that. That those things are psychological techniques, but they're also well-known joke writing techniques as well. So don't necessarily need to be a psychiatrist to understand that principle if you're writing comedy.
what is it that you find funny personally? Because that would obviously also inform what you then take to the stage. Like, what kind of comedy are you into?
Yeah, I mean, I enjoy a wide range of comedy. I'm probably somebody who doesn't laugh easily. So if a comedian makes me really laugh, that stands out. And I suspect the element of surprise and also a joke that just builds on more and more ridiculous are both things that tend to make me laugh as well. There's also another aspect, which is really appreciating clever jokes, that you really enjoy the joke but may not actually laugh out loud to it. And I've also found that a bit, that whenever I've written really clever jokes, it often doesn't get that big laugh out loud, that just some silly unexpected thing or an in the moment tag at the end of a joke that you make in response to something. So yeah, it is very interesting, the whole psychology of laughter and what makes people laugh.
How do you prepare for a set? Are you someone who has notebooks of ideas and thoughts? Do you record yourself? Like, how do you formulate from an idea one about what could be a joke through to performing it on stage as a part of your Cool Mum set?
Yeah, I mean, I guess having a scientist background, being a doctor originally, I probably have a fairly sort of scientific, I guess, approach to it, that I record every set that I do, and I go through and kind of do laughometer ticks on every place that audiences laugh, and then I record that set several times and see where the dead areas are and where the solid gold hits are, and then modify and tweak. And so it's a process like that for me that I started fairly early on. A lot of people have commented how tight my material is, and I think a lot of that is because of the constant recording, and just very subtle changes of words or orders of words can make a big difference. So I tend to have a lot of my jokes are very kind of specifically to the word, but I also, having been an improviser for 25 years, do quite a lot of ad-libbing extra things in terms of commenting on what's happening in the room and with audience members and things. So that keeps it fresh, but the actual material is very finely tweaked down to sort of specific words.
Sounds like you it's like as you're talking about, the picture in my head is you've got a recipe, which is the cake, which is very specific and very measured, but you've got the icing, which is something that you can add in as the impromptu kind of off the cuff stuff, but the cake formula or recipe is always, to the teaspoon or to the gram every time for the foundation of it.
It's a good answer. But I think it's often the kind of wild bits of chocolate chips that you throw on the icing that bring the absolute gold, and they're things that are very much in the moment. And in my solo show, there's a lot of audience interaction, so it's quite different each time depending on who's in the audience and what happens. So that certainly keeps it fresh and fun for me as well.
As the cool mum, how do you obviously that's based on being a mum and stories that you've seen and worked out, and maybe you've heard from other mums and then extrapolated from them. How do you take what was maybe something that was real and move it into an onstage appropriate amount of information? Or do you not worry about that? Like, I watch some comedians who are brutal about their family and their children. Like, there is no line of demarcation. And I remember watching the Howard Stern movie. Howard Stern talks about, I have to be all or nothing. There can be no filter between my private and my professional life, or it won't work. So his theory was everything is out and everything is on the floor and everything is able to be talked about. What about for you when you've got not just a parent, but obviously, again, someone who understands and works in areas of mental health? Maybe you'd be more sensitive to, children's information going out there than some, brutal American comedian who talks about everything because the only objective they've got is to get a laugh.
Yeah. And I think that is a difficult boundary. All of the parenting stories are based on truth. So they're all genuine experiences that I've had as a parent. And all of the material about my children, I run through with them before I perform it. partially to see their response to it, to see if it's funny, and secondly, to check that they're okay with the content. Because ultimately my relationship with my children is much more important than a laugh on stage. But at the same time, I think the things that do bring the humour are partially my inadequacies as a parent and partially very relatable things about teenage boys and girls, like grunting teenage boys and eye-rolling girls who are stroppy to their parents and things. So it's fairly universal, the themes, in terms of where the humour is. And I guess some of the amplification then on stage is, I guess in comedy, there's always a little bit of exaggeration. So it starts with truth, and then there's a little bit of exaggeration in a few directions, or some things that crossed my mind that I could have done but didn't, because I'm hopefully a better parent than that, or didn't want to completely embarrass my children. But certainly the core of all the stories that I do in my solo show are based on true parenting experiences. And I think that's what makes it real and relatable, because it's unique, specific stories, as opposed to, hey, teenagers, what's with them? And both my teenagers are part of the show. They're both in video clips and photo images, because the premise of the show is that it's a personal development seminar and people are there to learn to be a cool parent or get their parents to be cooler. So there are video clips of how to act like a teenager with your teenager, with role reversal and teenage boy observations in the wild and interpreting teenage boy grunts and things like that. So my kids are all, and some of their friends are all involved in that.
So do you have actual interaction on screen? You've got big screen stuff going on with teenagers as a part of your seminar?
So the whole show has got images and slides and audience interaction and video clips and things through it. So it's very multimedia.
You must enjoy is it Harry Enfield, who does his Kevin character. Like, as an adult then doing, it feels like a step away from what you're doing, but having an adult then interpret what a teenager is, not to be the cool parent, but actually to be the smiley, the kind of shitty little kid, for want of a better word, to give his parents grief. I'm assuming you've probably seen that. He's been around for quite a while, but that kind of feels like a comedian doing the other side of the same coin that you're doing. You're doing the cool parent, maybe missing the mark to the normal kids. He's doing the bastard kid, missing the mark to the normal parents.
Yeah. And certainly one of the video clips that I do is basically a role reversal clip that, according to my daughter, is not that different from real life, where I'm basically acting like a teenager and she's in a parentified role. So that was quite fun to do in terms of amplifying the worst of teenage behaviour on screen.
What about in your patient world? Now, obviously, there'll be a huge amount of patient privacy and sensitivity, but is there an area where are you able to talk about things that happen in that workspace, but not obviously reveal any, like, are you allowed to tell stories about a patient experience that doesn't identify who that patient is, or is that even too far in the area of patient confidentiality?
I mean, it's too far for me,
right, okay.
Because I try and keep those two careers very separate. That I basically am very careful to even not really have jokes about mental health, other than, fairly universal vulnerabilities like parent having a glass of wine to cope with parenting and things like that. But certainly any jokes I've written, if I look at them and go, it's a bit too close to a mental health joke for my comfort, I'll just get rid of them.
So you just stay away from that sort of mental health comedy area altogether?
Yeah, and certainly in my solo show, Ghastly, the cool mum, isn't a psychiatrist.
Yeah.
She's basically someone with no qualifications whatsoever, other than thinking that she's a cool mum. So it's very much, I kind of make a bit of a joke about, bloody Nigel Latter on TV with his university education, thinking he's better than me. So try and make it clear that this is sort of coming from a place of no qualifications. It's just a mum thinking she's more cool than the other mums and wanting to share that information. So I do have a few jokes where I've got a tag, especially as a psychiatrist, that I do in shorter sets where I'm being a bit more me on stage than Joe Ghastly. But certainly in the premise of the solo show, it's Joe Ghastly isn't a psychiatrist.
Have you?
Yeah, I mean, other psychiatrists might feel differently, but for me, it's just too kind of fragile an area to even de-identified allude to anything to do with how people might present to me. So I've sort of made a decision to just stay away from that completely in terms of my comedy.
Have you ever had one of your patients / clients turn up to a show not realising it was you and then seeing you on stage in this different persona?
Yeah, so I've certainly had somebody that I saw quite a few years ago in the audience at a lineup show, and we sort of looked at each other and went, "Oh, yes." So it wasn't somebody who I was currently seeing. It was a while ago.
It must be a bit like that whole Alcoholics Anonymous thing where, you're not supposed to identify where you know someone from. It must be like, oh yeah, hi, or if you meet someone, a former workmate, or it must be a way to kind of identify that you know that person without releasing where you know them from.
Yeah, no, exactly. And so if I see people that I've seen professionally in the street or somewhere, I'll just sort of smile hello to them, but not necessarily kind of go up to them or anything. So just to acknowledge, hi, I've seen you, but not put them in a position that might be uncomfortable of having to introduce me to somebody, or not wanting to acknowledge that part of their life when they're out, on the town having a fun time, and not wanting to think about mental health consultations. So I've had at least one person come to see one of my shows who fed back later that it was great seeing that I was a real person and a balanced person and had another life. And so for them it was positive. I have had one person who, it was actually more related to film acting I do, who became quite confused about reality and whether the consultations were actually part of a film set and things. So
wow.
That's probably the only time where it's caused some anxiety for someone who was very unwell and wasn't sure if I was a real psychiatrist or acting as a psychiatrist and things. But that was a one-off experience with someone who was very unwell at the time. So
is that something?
So I'm aware that for some people it might be an issue, but generally not.
Is that something you think of, like when you're getting into it, like as a psychiatrist? Do you kind of go, I need to be careful what I do outside of the my office when I've got clients or patients?
Yeah, I think so. I think probably similar to most professional roles where there's a degree of responsibility, whether a police officer or a teacher or a doctor or, any role where you're in a position where you've got responsibility and you're making decisions about people's lives and things like that. I think you do need to have a higher level of making sure that you're sort of living as a role model or not doing things that you wouldn't want people who you see professionally to see you do. Obviously it's a grey area, but certainly if there's anybody I know professionally in the audience, I think there's sort of a filter that goes through in terms of perhaps dropping some jokes that might feel a bit marginal, and in the same way I do if families in the audience or there's younger kids in the audience as well. You just have a bit of a filter of doing your absolute squeaky clean material.
Except the difference between, say, you and a, let's say, police officer is that when you see what would be your client, they could be in a situation where their reality is skewed, and that could be confusing. More often than not, when a police officer sees, I guess, what would be their client, someone in a car who's been speeding, it's unlikely that there's going to be that issue of potential confusion because of why you're seeing your client versus why they're seeing someone. So that might make it a bit different, I guess. But yeah, so you actually.
So I think a psychiatrist is probably a particularly delicate role in terms of other performing careers, and certainly I think in terms of acting roles, there are probably some acting roles that I wouldn't accept because it would feel like crossing a boundary.
Such as what? Such as what kind of role?
Well, I guess because I work with a lot of people who've had a trauma history, particularly sexual assault history. If I was offered a role where I was a sexual assault perpetrator, that would probably be a role that I'd go,
course.
no can do.
Yeah.
It would just be too difficult if anybody that I saw professionally see me even in an acting role in that role, that would be a boundary. So
yeah, well, it's interesting because so often when I'm talking to comedians, I ask them the question or some in the theme of the question, is there anything you don't talk about on stage? And mostly the answer is no, I talk about everything. Everything can be joked about. That's kind of a part of their line of comedy. But it sounds like what you're saying, that you do draw lines in the sand, and you maybe even draw lines in the sand on a different set on a different night depending on who's in the audience.
Yeah, definitely. So I think that's probably even beyond being a psychiatrist, but just me as a person as well, in terms of, and also very sensitive to, is it my story? Because I think comedy needs to be making fun of your story as opposed to other people's stories, and particularly not punching down. So I see making fun of my kids who are, white, privileged, attractive, sporty, popular, cool young people as definitely punching up, in terms of, we're kind of laughing at teenage boys doing something, they're all confident young people who aren't vulnerable. So I feel comfortable that any sort of laughter that's not at my expense is punching up rather than punching down.
And it sounds like you're also saying they're a part of the process. Not only are they all those things you've just listed,
exactly.
they're also approving it.
Yeah, they're consenting. Yeah. They're volunteering their own creativity of what grunts they're doing and what behaviour they're doing in the video clips and things. So, so it feels like it's a consenting process. I guess it's often a fine line, and I think one of the trickiest things in comedy is audience interaction roles, and I do have a tendency to make sure in those roles as well that I'm punching up as much as possible. And so if I'm bringing an audience member up on stage, I tend to generally pick sort of confident looking white guys, or if there's a big group of women, I ask them, who's your leader? So that I choose who's the kind of most confident in that group, who people feel comfortable that if there's a bit of laughter at their expense that they're going to enjoy it rather than people feeling uncomfortable. So so that's probably another area where there's some complex psychology around what's a fun time for everybody and what could be awkward.
It's such an interesting dynamic to hear you talking about it that way, because so often, like I'm thinking, I don't know if you know the piece, but for people who don't follow comedians so much, very, very famous and one of the top echelon comedians in America is a guy called Bill Burr, and he does this piece. If people Google Bill Burr 13 minutes Philadelphia, they'll come across on YouTube this piece that he did at Philadelphia where basically he screamed at the audience for 13 minutes. And I put it, and it's because it was the audience were being terrible. They were, not giving the group of stand-ups a chance. They were talking over them. They were being rude. And he just tore them and Philadelphia to ribbons for 13 minutes. I put it up on my Facebook page once because I think it's hilarious. And there was a good number of people that went, I just don't get this. He's just yelling at them. And they couldn't see what he was doing with it. But in that instance, there's no question he was punching down. Because he was the man at the front with the mic. He was the famous comedian, and he was basically annihilating all of the people in the audience and all of Philadelphia based on them being douchebag audience members for that moment because of how rude they were being. And it felt appropriate, in that instance, to punch down per se. But most people would say kind of what you're saying about they're always careful not to punch down. But it just feels like it must be such a hard thing to do on stage. Like, what if you get the wrong leader of the female group up, or what if the big male that you put up on stage is actually a very shy and I'm not actually talking about necessarily what you do, but in general, trying to hit those marks must be difficult at times.
Yeah, I do hopefully use some of the skills I have as a psychiatrist in terms of reading people's body language and facial expressions, that if somebody's clearly quite anxious and uncomfortable, I tend to pay them a lot more compliments and be much more encouraging. Whereas if someone's cheeky and cocky and obviously having a ball up there, I'll tend to do much sort of harsher roasts. So I do modify it depending a bit on who's up there and in terms of how I interact with them as well. Because there's some people you can roast pretty hard and everybody has a good time, and there's other people who it's much more delicate and it's all about bolstering them and making them look good and making them look as sort of funny on stage so that people enjoy it.
I'm sure all comedians do exactly what you're talking about. I'm sure they all have a filter on stage, and unless they, when I was working in radio, we used to talk about blowing a foo-foo valve. I used to work in talkback, so occasionally you'd get so annoyed with the shift or the night or the callers, you'd blow a foo-foo valve, which basically meant you kind of got a bit too grumpy and a bit too annoyed for inappropriate reasons. You shouldn't have. So you went one step too far. But I'm sure all comedians have exactly what you're talking about. But I think this is the first time I've ever actually talked to someone kind of to talk through how on stage to figure out your audience member, what is appropriate, what is not. Because so often you hear comedians, maybe most comedians need that bravado and they just kind of go, everything's up for grabs, nothing's a problem, any joke can be made. But I'm sure when push comes to shove, they all do exactly what you're saying, which is in this moment, that person, I got to be more careful with that person. They're being a dick, but I can see that they're X, Y, Z, and I need to be slightly more gentle than I would be on other nights.
Yeah, and I think, to be fair, some comedians have a lot more self-awareness than others. The comedians who tend to get bad names and people don't want them at their venue and don't put them on lineups are people who repeatedly overstep those marks. So they insult audience members who are offended and upset. They do jokes that are very inappropriate for the crowd at the night who are offended. They let loose on audience members inappropriately because they've had a bad day. So, I think comedians who don't have that self-awareness to be able to read an audience and be appropriate to the setting, or have their own self-awareness to know what's their stuff and what's funny and what's not, tend to struggle in comedy in terms of people wanting them on their stage.
Do you look to comedians overseas? Like, do you have some favourites that you follow and watch or particularly enjoy?
Yeah, I mean, it's been really more recently that I've started to watch other comedians. I did consciously when I first started out not watch other comedians because I wanted to develop a unique me and not be influenced by watching other comedians, and then a bit by osmosis develop some of their techniques or mannerisms. I do tend to really enjoy British comedy,
right?
As opposed to American. To be fair, I haven't watched a lot of American comedy, but scrolling through on Facebook videos and things, I'm much more likely to enjoy a new person who's a British comedian who I haven't seen before than someone who's American on average. So comedians like Sarah Millican and things like that, and saw Russell Howard live in Christchurch a few weeks ago.
Nice.
There's something about British humour. I guess growing up as a kid and watching British comedy on TV with my parents, the British humour tends to resonate with me more probably than American humour on average.
Yeah, I'm going to see Russell Howard tonight, actually. I'm really looking forward to it.
Yeah, no, he's amazingly talented. Yeah.
Yeah, I was lucky enough to have him for an hour a couple of weeks ago, and that was great fun. And I also know Bill Bailey's. Actually, Bill Bailey might be in town now, might be in New Zealand, but he's going to be performing. Oh, actually, he's probably not quite here yet because he's got to do a 2 weeks isolation. He's going to be doing a nationwide tour as well, and I think they're putting on more dates again, like Russell Howard did, because if you're going to have to spend 2 weeks in isolation, you might as well, you know.
Make the most of being here.
Yeah, doesn't make much sense to sit in isolation for 2 weeks and do 3 shows, does it?
Yes, and I think a novelty for New Zealand audiences to see international acts after a year of nothing. So
yeah. No, talking to Russell Howard, it was like he was fizzing at the bunghole. He was like, can't believe it that we're going to have, I mean, I think here in Dunedin, with the hall they're in, I think there's going to be 400, which is not huge. I'm not sure what there was in Christchurch, but between 400 and 1,000 in most locations. He was just fizzing. He couldn't wait. It was really exciting to see the excitement. I'm sure he was great when you saw him.
No, definitely, and certainly I think for most comedians, and maybe the case for most live performers, there's a real buzz that comes from being on stage and connecting with the audience and having the audience in the palm of your hand. And I think certainly a lot of comedians I knew during lockdown became quite depressed with not having a stage to perform on and lost a lot of their creative spark and things. So it's probably the minority that found various online ways to meet those needs and connect with others. But certainly it was quite good timing for me because I finished writing my show and ended up performing it as an online webinar to various comedians around the world who were sitting at home twiddling their thumbs and were quite happy to watch my show and give me feedback. So,
nice.
So that was a silver lining of the whole process.
Well, it's crazy to think we're in February now. And I know that the reason we connected was through the Fringe festivals, and you're doing Wellington and Dunedin this year. I still kind of want to say you're doing Wellington, Dunedin this year, assuming that we're all okay, because I think that with the COVID thing at the moment, we would be naive to think that it's not going to get back into the community at some stage on some level. Because I was just thinking,
exactly.
I was thinking as you were talking.
I mean, we've been amazingly lucky with the various escaping of COVID cases into the community over the last 6 months or so, that none of those have turned into super spreader events that they could very well have done. It was interesting listening to Michael Baker on Radio New Zealand last week, talking about that 80% of COVID cases, have a fairly low spreading index, whereas 20% are super spreaders. So I guess it's a numbers game in New Zealand with so few cases getting into the community that we haven't had a super spreader so far. So.
Yeah, but I was just thinking back when you said you were at home doing it. It was it's getting close to this time last year, because I know down here, I was potentially going to be doing some work with the Dunedin Fringe Festival and do some live streaming and some videoing, and that was basically that was the week that we all had to shut down. Was the week that the Dunedin Fringe Festival was about to launch.
Very bad timing for Dunedin Fringe,
Yeah, because we were thinking about, when I say we, I was talking to them about, it was their idea, about, we weren't quite in level 4 lockdown, so there was still a little bit of freedom, but turning it into an online Fringe Festival and having live stream performances as opposed to people in theatre performance. And then it went to level 4 and everything locked down anyway, but... No, it's fascinating to think about. Well, that was only this time last year. It was a similar
dilemma for Nelson Fringe in August, because it went to level 2 a couple of days before Nelson Fringe, and I'd actually flown to Nelson and was due to perform the next day, and they were trying to work out desperately how to make it work at the last minute in level 2 by moving to a bigger venue, but then there weren't enough seats even with the bigger venue, and they couldn't have 2 back-to-back shows with audience mingling, and it became quite a nightmare for them to try and work out how they could run it in level 2, so ended up going all online at the last minute. I mean, I was fortunate to still be able to do mine live to a much smaller audience to film it, but it was certainly incredibly stressful times for all the Nelson Fringe organisers, with it all happening, basically the day before the festival was due to open, with sold out shows and things. So
yeah, And it is fascinating to look at what's happening around the world still at the moment and how the normality of COVID has kicked in and how many television shows now have got perspex screens between contestants or panelists or whatever it is. And that's, pardon me, rather than kind of moving away and getting away from COVID, they've just accepted that COVID's there and now they're working with it. I even watch it.
Yeah.
I've got a guy online that I follow who plays poker, and he films it himself with his iPhone, and then he writes it up afterwards. And even there, in these poker sittings in the casinos in Las Vegas, everyone sits in a booth like this around them with
in their own bubble.
Yep,
Yeah.
and they've got like a little gap at the bottom of it, just that big, and that's where they put their cards under. And so
Wow.
that's the normality. That's the way the world is around us at the moment. And I guess here in New Zealand, we've got this little. I think sometimes we are a bit smug, and I put my hand up, kind of going, "Yeah, I can go to the Black Caps in a month's time." But you know, it's you look what's happening around the rest of the world, and it's almost like they've given up and they've decided to figure out how to work with COVID rather than fight against COVID.
Yeah, and I guess when you're in a country with an incredibly high rate of COVID in the community, that's essentially the only way it's going to die out is over time with vaccinations and time, and it could still be kind of years off before it's gone. You know, you either modify your life or you give up, really, don't you?
Yeah, it's still a crazy time, but I mean, I think hopefully, especially for the live. Look, I was going to show you this. Can I show you this? This is what I'm talking about. Bring my computer screen up. You see this? This is the guy who I follow playing poker. See all around here? These are all perspex shields around every other person. So you've got a whole perspex shield around you. They're all wearing masks, and you just slide your things underneath. So, you know, that's what's happening around the world. They're just living with it rather than fighting against it.
Must make reading body language and facial expressions in poker a bit more challenging through perspex and a mask.
Possibly. Well, his name is Brad Owen. I've had him on the podcast before. He's a professional player, and he's doing very well over the last couple of months. So maybe it works for him. I don't know, or maybe he's just on a good run.
Yeah, might be very good at reading eyes, and that's all.
Yeah, true, because of the mask and stuff. I was going to ask you as well. The cool mum stuff as well. Obviously, you talk about yourself and your life, and obviously the idea sounds like it is kind of the mum character is the butt of many of the jokes. But you must have learned stuff along the process of making this show that's kind of informed you about your parenting, and surely others have come to you at the end of a show. You've heard back from people who have seen it and learned from it as well. You know, I often say that in medieval times, the only one that could tell the truth to the king without fear of his head being cut off was the jester. That was the only person. Though exactly. Comedy can bring absolute truth totally directly. Tell me how your show has informed and helped you in your parenting, and if you've had any experiences of others coming to you saying they've learned from this comedy show as well.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I've done is very consciously put a few truthful parenting messages in the show. So I've done that surrounded by jokes, but still a clear message. You know, an example is that you don't have to be a perfect parent. You only need to be good enough, a bit like a pilot. You know, so it sort of turns into a joke, but there's a clear message there that's a take-home message. So there's several of those through the show that I've purposely put in as hopefully little nuggets that people can go home with as things that have helped me in my parenting journey. So I guess that's a little bit a combination of being a parent and also being a psychiatrist, and done sort of postgraduate diplomas in parent, infant, mental health and things like that. So a lot of that early parenting philosophy is something I'm very familiar with. I think another sort of issue along that theme is the importance of being able to use humor as a coping mechanism, because I guess a lot of people do comedy as a way of coping with darkness and struggles. And certainly I think for me, parenting's been the hardest thing I've done. There's probably been nothing in my role as a psychiatrist that compares with some of the challenges of being a parent and parenting teenagers and working out how to do it right. And, you know, that it is a very challenging role. And so being able to find the humour in the things that have gone wrong or have been difficult is a coping mechanism as well. So I think that's been a little bit of an insight to me in terms of one of the reasons why I'm doing comedy now is to be able to process some of that stuff. And that it also resonates with other people who go, yeah, parenting's hard, and oh, that's kind of really awkward, or that's a gross parenting inadequacy, but yep, I've been there. So there's a relatability there that I think is important, and that ability to laugh, maybe that your teenage boy hasn't actually really said a full sentence for years. But if you can all laugh together at interpreting teenage boy grunts, then that's a way of coping with that difficult stage of life as well. And I think because comedy amplifies vulnerabilities and areas of weakness, it helps you to look sort of face on, head on at some of the things that are your vulnerabilities in parenting. I talk quite openly about stalking teenagers on social media to try and work out if your kid's new love interest is kind of a decent kid, and by sort of looking through all their social media and seeing if they look okay or not. So that's where my stand-up came from, and also, looking on Urban Dictionary at what all the different words that the kids were using meant to know whether it was a good thing or a bad thing. And then getting to the point that you go, I'm legit salty because you juked my shit, or you guys are legit Gucci AF like Hundo P Totes Fire Fam, sure. So getting to the point that you're fairly fluent in teenage lingo as a development from a survival mechanism, I guess, of looking up what words mean.
What do you think the end game is here for you? I mean, it sounds like at the moment you're obviously a psychiatrist. Okay, let me say what it seems like you are, and you tell me if I'm completely wrong. You're a psychiatrist who does comedy significantly, but on the side, and occasional things like acting gigs. That seems to be what you're describing to me. It'd be interesting to know, if you could wave the magic wand or whatever, what's the end game? Is this the perfect life performance, home balance, or if you had the opportunity to be kind of full-time comedy, is that what you want to do? What's your end game?
I think it's an evolving sort of career mix. Certainly through the last sort of 20 years since I've been a psychiatrist and a parent, it's been a juggling act between parenting and psychiatry in terms of the number of hours that I do, and sort of peaking at about 20, 30 hours a week, I guess. Now that my kids are 17 and 20 and they're both very independent young people, they're getting to the point that the less parental involvement, the better from their point of view. So there is more time available to focus on things in my life rather than sort of the parenting role being as much of a focus. I've also, since September last year, reduced my psychiatrist hours considerably so that I do have scope to spend more time with comedy, because developing a solo show and touring it is pretty time intensive. So I have cut down to one morning a week of clinical work and then doing report writing around that. So it is getting to the point that it's about 50-50 in terms of amount of time spent each week on the two careers. And I guess thinking next year, particularly if the world opens up a bit more, that I'll probably be spending quite a lot of time going to festivals in Australia, and hopefully Edinburgh Fringe if that's back on track next year. So I'm seeing, I'd like to keep doing some psychiatry work, and sort of one part of that is doing sort of ACC sensitive claims assessments, which are sort of a standalone piece of work that you can book in around your time away with comedy. So it would be quite easy to sort of keep that going, even if I was doing a lot of comedy in a way a lot as well. So that's the sort of medium term goal, is to do more comedy and have the psychiatry more contained, to keep that going, but with less ongoing commitment in terms of follow-up people.
Well, Joe, it's been fascinating and enjoyable to talk to you today. Why don't we tell people, if I go to your, is the Facebook page the best place to go if people want to know dates and stuff?
Yeah, well, I think the Joe Ghastly Facebook page has got probably most of the content in terms of Facebook events for all of my shows and sort of updates on different things. I do also have a website, joeghastly.com, that's got the basic information, but following my Facebook page is probably the best way to keep up to date with things.
So in saying that, at the moment, having a look at what we can see, Christchurch, February 27th, Wellington, is that part of the Fringe, March 11th to 13th?
Yeah, so Wellington, the 11th to the 13th of March at Cabin Club. That's part of New Zealand Fringe, and it's about just over half sold out already. So Wellington's enthusiastic to come along, which is great.
Cool. And then you're in Dunedin, March 21, Christchurch, April 9, Waiheke, May 15. So there's plenty of dates up there if people want to check you out and see what you're all about. It's been a pleasure to talk to you. I think you're fascinating, your background, and especially your sort of medical work leading to someone on stage. It makes for a sort of fascinating through line of what your real life to what your comedy must be, and I look forward to seeing you on stage when you come to Dunedin.
Yeah, no, definitely. You'll have to let me know that you can definitely come, and I'll organise a comp ticket for you when they're available next week.
We'll figure that out. I tend to not take comps because I know how much of a struggle it is. I mean, like, if it was a Bill Bailey comp for $100, maybe, but when tickets are kind of 15 or $20 or whatever,
I figure you can stretch to that.
Yeah, I mean, I understand a little bit about theatre and about how margins are tight and that kind of stuff. So typically, I don't, but I'll certainly, and you should certainly stay in touch because we'd love to see you on stage here in Dunedin, and I'm sure other people want to see you on stage around the country. And as you've just said, Joe Ghastly on Facebook and joeghastly.com is probably the place to go to find out when and where you're going to be. But it's been a blast. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you, Pat.